Welcome everybody, my name is Poison Ducky, and today I'm going to go over the unit balancing and changes to overall multiplayer. Like a very big disclaimer here, this is really going to be about multiplayer changes and how I think they're going to affect the meta, or even how factions deal with certain sort of roles and counters to that in the multiplayer quick battle tournament scene overall. Not going to go over the campaign changes as much, but let's get right into it. First of all, in terms of unit balancing, there are some ROR changes to make sure that the morale goes from like slightly higher, or base reload times and melee defense changes. Mainly just makes it so that they're consistent with their normal unit if they are Golden Chevron versus the Regiment of Renown. Not really anything too great there. Unit name adjustments as well, it's like, oh well, visual improvements, that's great. But the first thing, and where we start off, where we start getting bigger things, is the Beastmen. Now over here at Razor Gore Chariots, cost decreased from 1,100 to 1,000. Now it's an interesting change for sure. Now if you look at the Beastmen roster, the reason why Razor Gore Chariots are not brought very often is because their casters are usually brought on their own Razor Gore Chariots. Usually they have, you'll see a caster Lore of Wild and a caster Lore of Beast, so that they can get all of their summons off, along with not Malagor, but Morgur the Shadowgave. And then you get this sort of like really high pressure single entity chariots are better than multi entity chariots, excuse me. So it's overall, you just bring those, you get the jagged daggers on them, you get so many summons, you get extremely high value out of your Winds of Magic use. Now you don't want to bring the Razor Gore Chariots there because first of all, they're not single entity, they can get stuck, and while they are pretty good for chariot standards, like they're essentially a cheaper Gore Beast chariot, which I really like about them, you just don't have a need for them in the Beastmen roster. Now I'm not saying you don't bring them, you bring them. I would bring them in the Greenskin, the Tomb Kings, or maybe even, well, obviously the Dwarf matchup. So those three matchups can be very useful to have Razor Gore Chariots to get into those back lines, deal with those Ushabti, deal with those Archers or Orc Air Boys, and even getting into those Thunderers and such. But overall, cool change, but I don't think it'll affect them that much. Now, the biggest change here, which you would think is not too huge, unless you know you play Beastmen a lot, cost increase from 550 to 600 is actually really big, because in many matchups like the Greenskin, any counter rush, Norskin rush matchup, anything where you have to deal with infantry fast and really hit extremely hard in a small amount of time, you bring a Razor Gore Herd, as they're like really shock heavy, like almost like wild cav. They're very similar to like squigs when I use these things, but you usually bring like 3 to 4 of these, and 3 to 4, like if you bring 4 of them in a matchup, that's an extra 200 gold to your army cost. That's a really big difference with Razor Gore Herd, because I will admit they do pay, they're super cost efficient. They're probably one of the best units for the cost on the Beastmen roster, and increasing this, it's probably deserved. But overall, like it's going to hurt them, because this means like 100, 200 increase pretty much means you're going to have to change a Gore Herd to something like an Ungore Herd. Now moving on from that, we do have Minotaurs with shields, decreased melee defense 1. It won't really make that much a difference. I believe it's mostly believed overall, like as most Beastmen players overall, you guys can comment on this, but it's just that Minotaurs with great weapons are just worse than Minotaurs with shields for stat wise. Although the great weapons do have bonus versus large, the Minotaurs with shields just have enough melee attack that they can deal just fine with large targets, and the shields increasing their melee defense is really quite large, so there's just this little small bump. And that's actually all for the Beastmen. Pretty small in terms of number of changes, but very powerful in terms of this one change here for the Razor Gore Herds. Plus 50 cost, actually going to hurt quite a bit. So Bretonnia is largely believed to be the weakest faction right now, mainly due to this, they just don't have the ability to deal with single entity armored monsters. It's really tough for them to deal with right now. You have to do a lot of cycle charging with something like Questing Knights, the Companions of Quenelle for instance, and maybe even use an Air Force. A lot of people have been trying to get like Royal Hippogriff Knights to cycle charge single entities along with King Luan Lianke, or even Alberic de Bordelot. But let's see their changes. Now, the first change in terms of units is they're increasing melee defense for Questing Knights. That's actually quite nice, mainly because Questing Knights are the one cavalry unit you actually kind of want to stay in combat, especially against single entity monsters, but they are increasing the cost of the Companions of Quenelle. Companions of Quenelle are pretty much the best non Blood Knight cavalry in the game. I would say they're the second best cavalry in the game, at least for dealing with other cavalry units or large targets for sure. As long as you're they're second to the Blood Knights, and that's really about it. They're super good as long as you heal them up and do the correct like sort of winds of magic use to keep these guys up. They're very cost effective, and the 50 cost will hurt a little bit, but that just means you cut like a peasant, right? It's not too much of a hit. Green Knight is probably one of the least cost-effective units in the game for terms of single-entity hero slots. Most people will tend to take Gotrek or Felix, along with the Fey Enchantress, or some combination of that, or King Lewin plus a healer, and maybe a Paladin to support. Green Knight, you don't really bring in many matchups. It's only thing I really can think about the Green Knight is that it is very effective due to its terror causing. Being ethereal is actually really not that great in this current like meta game sort of field. So cost decrease from 1900 to 800 is nice, so you can bring it more often. And Green Knight could possibly be used, and even in like Greenskin matchup. Actually, no, with the Greenskins having the Deathcaster and all that sort of Gaze and Mork and all that stuff, I retract my statement. But Green Knight, nice. Pegasus Knights. Now, very interesting, it's not the Royal Pegasus Knights, just the normal one. I believe almost every single patch, these Knights have been getting buffed, but the main difference and the main reason why Pegasus Knights are awful is not because of the stats or the anti-large, it's because they just don't have the perfect vigor that Royal Pegasus Knights offer. Royal Pegasus Knights are just so much better at just that hit and run style, cause that really nice back flank just because they get the rear charge, you get those leadership bonuses, debuffs on the opponent and something like that. And Pegasus Knights just do not have the vigor for this to really work, and that's why even though you may increase the melee attack or anti-large, you really can't compare to Royal Pegasus Knights. Now, looking over at the overall Bretonnian buffs, do any of these really help with dealing with single entity monsters? Questing Knights, yes, but it's really too small to make up for their loss and the reason why they're having such a hard time in these matchups. So, yeah, I believe they're going to remain a lower tier. If anything, well, let's be honest, guys. It's lower tier doesn't mean too much in Total War Warhammer. Like, it just means like you just need to work a little bit harder. It's not like differences in fighting games where a lower tier in a fighting game is actually humongous versus a higher tier. It just means Bretonnia is not going to change too much and are going to have the same problems they had previously. Next up are the Dark Elves. So overall changes, I've briefly looked overall the Dark Elves, and I really actually kind of like it. So Scourge Runners, Cold Ones, they can no longer hide in Forest. That's kind of okay, whatever. And adding both units with a 360-degree fire arc cap so that you can't spam so many like 360-degree Parthian shot units. Not very enjoyable. Now, in terms of Sisters of Slaughter, I never really see too many people use these, mainly because of the light armor. It's a little too easy to just get a really good cavalry charge into Sisters of Slaughter, and they're just absolutely mullered. Like, you can bring them in the Dwarf matchup, and in the Dwarf matchup, this is why in the Dwarf matchup you actually bring Iron Drakes, like the Flamethrower Iron Drakes, and not the Torpedo ones as much. Well, you do bring actually both, in my opinion. But Fire is really effective against Dark Elves and sort of like Flamethrower type units like Warp Throwers and all that stuff. Sister of Slaughter's losing 2 melee defense is going to hurt them, but you know, it could be worse. It's not too many matchups that they're used in the first place, in my opinion. Now, Slaanesha's Harvester is probably one of the most effective RORs in the game in terms of the Doomfire Warlocks, or just any ROR overall. It's because they have the Word of Pain and the Soul Stealer attached to them. Cost increase from 1400 to 1450. I believe it's deserved. They're probably really, really powerful for the level, but every single faction needs their powerful units to be like up there. And cost increase 50 it's not going to hurt as much as, like, for instance, the Beastmen when the Razorgore herd, because Razorgore herd are brought several times compared to the Slaanesha's Harvesters. Dark Shards cost reduce by 25. It'll make a difference, but Dark Shards are actually really rarely brought in favor of Shades or Bleak Arc Corsairs with hand crossbows, mainly because the hand crossbows can defend themselves in melee against hounds or like bats and many things like that, and they have decent armor from taking shots from like archers. Or Shades are straight up just invisible, they have stalk, you can't really see them until the moment they fire at you, and their armor piercing is simply much higher, and they are more bursty than Dark Shards. Overall, I would say for the Dark Shard changes, this is really just a kick in the nuts for the Dawi, because that's really the only matchup I see them brought en masse, because you bring the ROR Dark Shards and the Dark Shards with shields, and the ROR applies Shield Breaker, and Dark Shards can just shoot the Dawi, and then all of a sudden the shields and the Dark Shards stop the Quarrelers, and the armor piercing is very cost effective for the Dark Elves in that matchup. And so the matchup for the Dark Elves and the Dawi just got a little bit harder with the cost reduction to Dark Shards. Now the Blood Rack Medusa, increasing melee attack from 30 to 34 and the Regiment Renown. Now the problem with the Blood Rack Medusa is not actually its melee stats or its projectile. I think the projectile is fine. I believe it to be the arc of the projectile. I believe in a earlier stream this year, I did a unit testing stream, which I'll most definitely be doing, for these new units. So keep that in your calendars, or even your little mind to see in the future. Sorry, as I jumble my words. But Blood Rack Medusa is really not a problem with its attacks or anything or animations. It's really just about the fact that its arc is it can't fire over basic infantry of your own, even though it stands tall, so much taller. It's I think it needs to be, in terms of projectile, it should be closer to more be like a bone giant. So Blood Rack Medusa, you're awesome, you're cool looking. You're just still not really great. Malekith mounted on Seraphon. Now this is something I really never understood. For some reason he gets 20% physical resistance on a unit, on a dragon, no less, which is you compare it to the Wood Elves dragon, and Wood Elves dragon has a lot of physical resistance. Why can't Malekith have it? Well, you see, Wood Elf dragons don't have armor, nearly as much armor as Dark Elf dragons, and Malekith is a healing unit. He uses Soul Stealer, and he says, I'm going to get all my health back, and the more physical resistance you have, the more useful healing is. So there you have it. It's the same sort of principle you use for ethereal units, and in that case you need the more physical resistance, way more value from healing, and that's the reason why Malekith is probably the best Dark Elf Lord. He gets so much value from healing, he gets bound spells. It's just ridiculous in my opinion. I think I was completely honest, I kind of wish they'd just take away the physical resistance, but that's just me. So Charybdis, increase HP from 9,458 to 10,400. That's really nice, and decrease cost by 100. The Charybdis is kind of well known for a meme. The only matchup that I see for the Dark Elves that they use this, well, without memeing, of course, if you want to fully use this in a competitive build, it's versus the vampire counts, because the applying poison, the passive that has Abysmal Howl, reducing leadership, actually really doesn't matter that much, because mainly all the other factions that have projectiles just shoot the Charybdis, and the Charybdis doesn't have regeneration like a Hydra, so you just shoot it and it goes away. So the increased HP and decreased cost will pretty much just say, yeah, look at me more often when you go on the Dark Elf versus Vampire Counts matchup. So that's cool. Witch Elves on Cauldrons and Blood Rack Shrines can now use, so their daggers will no longer deal the same damage as the viewer does when ramming to enemies. Okay, that's just a small change. Now, before I go in the Dawi, overall changes. I do like the changes to the Dark Elves, although the Dark Shards just make it harder for Dawi. The Slaanesh's Harvesters, a very well-deserved cost increase, and Sisters of Slaughter, I'm just -2 melee defense is okay. I don't think they deserved it, to be completely honest. I don't remember too many matchups in which you use them. Maybe against Chaos and Dawi and maybe Greenskins, and that's really all I can think of. So overall, real nice changes with the Charybdis, but we already know we don't use that. And I wanted a bigger nerf on Malekith, me personally, because he's just a little bit too much of a raid boss for his cost. He's actually the one the only reason the Dark Elves are really top tier. It's him and Marathi, essentially. So, looking at Dwarf Cannons, Flame Cannons, Rangers, Gyro Bombers, Skyhammer. So the Flame Cannon decreased cost by 50, which is nice, but let's be honest, we don't really bring this except for, as before I mentioned, maybe the Dark Elf matchup. They just don't have enough AP, and the splash damage is just really nice, but it doesn't track cavalry very well. It can't hit flying targets. we all know that bringing a bolt thrower or just cannon is the way to go with the Dawi. Rangers with great weapons increasing ammunition from 8 to 12. Now that's actually kind of nice, specifically in matchups like the Lizardmen. Getting Ulthuar's Raiders and getting Rangers with great weapons to throw their throwing axes over on them, or something like a Mammoth, can be nice. It can be a nice alternative to bring Trollhammer torpedoes or even Thunderers, because Rangers are faster and they do have stock, so you can't shoot at them at range. So what I'm saying here is that Rangers with great weapons, the matchup between Dawi and Vampire Coast just got worse, because Rangers are mainly used in that matchup, being the ammunition holding them back with dealing with giant crabs. So Rangers having much more ammo with great weapons. Yeah, unfortunately, the ammunition is just enough to deal with crabs now, essentially, or even rotting leviathans and stuff like that. So the matchup just got worse for VP versus Dawi. So tough luck for them, but VP is a top-tier faction, so they should have a few bad matchups. Gyro Bomber having a suppress effect, which means, if I remember correctly, suppress reduces their speed by like 33%, which is really nice, and increased projectile explosion radius from 1 meter, essentially doubling their radius, right, which is much bigger in terms of diameter as a whole, right? So really big changes to Gyro Bomber in terms of their projectiles and their explosions, but I don't think they're going to be that useful still. Like suppressing, you can only attack one target at a time with the Gyro Bomber, unlike it doesn't hit very hard. The only other unit I think of that has a very powerful use of suppression is going to be the Rattling Guns, but that's because they have so much DPS. That slow makes a real big difference, because the damage per second is so high on Rattling Gunners that any second you get longer to shoot at a unit is so much more damage, right? Gyro Bomber having a little bit more time shooting at them really doesn't make a difference, and then you're just going to get shot out of the sky with either arrows, guns, harpies can come out and get you, some basic Fellbats even. Pretty tough for the Dawi in these changes. Not too much of a change with the Gyro Bombers. Overall, changes for Dawi is like, they're kind of nice with the Flame Cannon. The Rangers are nice for the VP matchup, because I don't use them in many other matchups, although I don't play the Dawi that often. But it's still overall a helpful. It's like a buff to the Dawi, right? So no nerfs, because they don't deserve any for sure. Now Griffins for the Empire. More effective against large group of enemies. It doesn't really make too much of a difference, because Griffins were really meant for dealing with single entity monsters on Karl Franz or even Boris Todbringer. Yeah, that's nice. Reduced cost for 900 to 800 for Imperial General. I think the only person I can think of is Dov's Place that uses the Empire General to use any sort of power play on those kind of things, where he jacks him up with the Lore of Shadow and anything like that. But quickly scrolling through, I'm not exactly sure what the Blood War ability will do on Boris Todbringer, so I'm gonna have to get back to that later. But Crossmen losing 25 costs. So ever since they brought in Empire Archers and Huntsmen, it's pretty much Crossbowmen have become obsolete. Archers are really cheap. They have a very loose formation, so other archers and projectiles aren't effective against them, or cost effective at least for their time. So crossbows, they just need help, mainly because maybe they should be more accurate or something like that, because cost reduction is nice, but compared to archers, huntsmen, or handgunners, especially like the silver bullets or something like that, crossmen have no place, as they don't have the armor piercing, they don't have the rate of fire or the volleys of fire, like how many projectiles they fire. So crossmen, they're not in a great place. Reducing their costs is not going to fix their problem. It's just that they don't have a role in the army of the Empire. So that's what I was saying. Maybe make them more accurate or something interesting like that. Hellstorm rocket batteries. Cost reductions 50. Hellstorm rocket batteries are cool, but they're just not... they're cool against the Elven factions, if I remember correctly. Not brought in many others, but the volley gun reduce as well. Reichsguard increasing melee defense. Now Reichsguard most people tend to bring Empire Knights, because they're cheaper. And when you're bringing Empire Knights, that means you're putting your money in like artillery or protecting things. Reichsguard are more units they're just like a higher tier, as they're just a little bit better in pretty much every single way. So Zintler's Reichsguard in general, the only reason you bring this is because they have Vanguard deployment. That's quite nice, and I believe immune to psychology. So it's just one buff in stat. Nothing extremely impactful. Most of those buffs don't have too much. And actually, from here on now, I'll look at them and acknowledge them, but I won't go too much into it. So War Wagons, base melee missile damage from 3 to 5, and AP missile damage from 15 to 25. That's essentially a 12 increase per damage in terms of missile damage, including the normal missile damage. So yeah, that's a lot of damage. Now, we'll have to compare to Scourge Runner Chariots, because Scourge Runner Chariots are essentially just what everyone says War Wagons are just wish they could be. But overall, they might hurt now. We will have to test this. We might look into it. War Wagons, will they no longer be a meme? Find out next time in the next episode of Dragon Ball Z. Now, War Wagons with mortars. The reason why everyone hates them is because their ammunition is pitiful and their range is okay. And look at that. Increased ammunition from 16 to 22, and their range from 340 to 380. Elves beware. The Wood Elves, the High Elves, and the Dark Elves. Well, Dark Elves less so because they don't bring as much infantry, or even archers of that caliber. So Wood Elves and High Elves, be scared, as these guys, War Wagons with mortars, actually a viable choice against them now, because previously the range was too low and they could be caught too easily, and the ammunition would run out way too fast before you could really kill anything. So yeah, that matchup just got a little bit harder for the Elven factions versus the Empire. Luminarch, increase armor from 40 to 60, increase HP as well. Luminarchs, actually, I do like them a lot. They have their place, and excuse me as I get a drip of water. Their increased armor will help it so they take projectiles more often, but here's the thing about Luminarchs. If they get compromised, they're compromised. They're usually going to die or rat off the battlefield. The HP is nice, so they can... This really just makes it so that they're better at taking projectiles, because if anything hits them in melee, they're pretty much going down. So doesn't actually really make that much of a change for the Luminarchs, or the Templehof Luminarch. Now, Greenskin, here is a huge portion. We're already like 20 minutes something into this video, and we just got to the Greenskins, so we're going to have to speed this up just a little bit. Don't want to bore everybody that watches this. And all the Lord characters have 150 cost because Wa is no longer in there, which is great, right? So Black Orcs is just a visual change. Skarsnik, Nightbloss, all of these changes for the Greenskins, I think would better be presented by on like Turin's channel, Dov's channel, Heir of Karthus channel, as they visually show you what's happening, since I don't have access to early access. But I'll give you my opinions on this. Skarsnik is going to be probably he's been my favorite lord in the Greenskin roster since before. I loved Crooked Moon. It's probably one of my earliest videos on Warhammer was about Crooked Moon and a replay when I played them back when I was so much worse at the game. But increased speed from 34 to 35, melee damage, all of sort of things. I think the main thing is just, it's the abilities, right? So them having the ability to have Vanguard deployment and get their, where is that? If you scroll down, a Ragnarok Spider, another big change, decreased armor from 150 to 120. That is actually really big because that means they'll take a lot more damage from arrows. The Greenskin matchup between Greenskins and Bretonnians and High Elves, it can be real tough because 150 armor is a lot of armor to get through for arrows to pierce. And HP increase with a melee attack increase as well. And they still keep their bonus versus large. So Ragnarok Spiders, I want to say an overall nerf losing that 30 armor. So, yeah, that's you heard it here first. Poison Ducky thinks that the decreased armor, even though increased health and everything, overall nerf, because the main weakness to large monsters like this are projectiles, and projectiles just got better at hitting them, right? Fanatics are so good now. I love this. I love that they can target them, but we can go to other channels if you want to look at them. They can just take out backline archers so well. Increased melee attack for hoppers. I don't think they really needed it. Squig hoppers are so good. They were so good. Their bonus versus infantry. I guess they'll be better at dealing with light cavalry, like other hoppers or even spider riders. But they really didn't need it. They were so good already. Death creepers. You don't really bring these because we're generating on a skirmish cavalry is not very useful unless you're expecting enemy skirmish cavalry. So I really only bring Forest Goblin Spider Rider archers in like against the Wood Elves or the Dark Elves, because you're expecting maybe even Empire, expecting other skirmish cav, because that's the low damage percent that the Death Creepers actually get value out of. Moon Howlers, let's be honest, no one really uses them, so it's like, that's okay. Doom Divers, that's really big. Doom Divers are one of the best units on the Greenskin roster, increasing by 50. I usually bring 2 of them, so that's like an 100 cost increase in your army when you do bring Doom Divers, because 1 just doesn't usually bring enough pressure, in my opinion. So that's really, really it hurts, because I love Doom Divers. I really like those sort of defensive boxes with Doom Divers or even Hell Cannons, which we'll get to later. Now, Orc Boar Boys, 55 to 65 armor and increase just 10 across the board, and most notably on the Broken Tusk mob. Now, if you look at other channels, like Turn specifically, to be honest, he posts a lot of replays where it's like, oh, the Orc Boar Boy Biggins have 85 armor from 75, which is nice. But that doesn't change the fact why Orc Boar Boys and Orc Boar Boy Biggins are bad. That's because of their melee stats. This will make it so they take a little bit less damage in combat and be better at projectiles, but the reason why these units are not good is because off the charge, without a charge bonus, they're really bad at hitting their units. So, yeah, it could be better. Excuse the slight jingling in the background. And High Elves. Now, High Elves changes on chariots. Please nerf the chariots so the metadata dictates area where a unit can logically attack. This issue has been fixed, so the logical attack areas they use are much more in line with the visual attack performed in melee combat. I hate nobles with chariots. I'll be completely honest. Nobles with chariots are just like the bane of my existence. They're super good, and unfortunately, while this makes so they're more consistent with their attack animations, I don't see a nerf, so oh boy. High Elf Mage's new lore magic, I think that's really great. I think the lores that really matter here are going to be metal and metal. The metal beasts is nice because Lord Manticore is probably one of the best spells in the game, but metal having to do Plague of Rust. Metal is my favorite lore magic, by the way, if you didn't know. Plague of Rust on something so you can just completely just blot the sky with arrows and stop large units. That'll be really nice. And new mounts for Alistar. Yeah, but he's campaign only, if I remember. Arcane Phoenix for Teclis, and a Griffin mount for both the Prince and Princess, which is very cost effective. So in terms of Arcane Phoenix for Teclis, I really like this change. If you haven't seen a replay with Total War, Milk and Cookies Total War, Teclis is actually a monster now, but we'll get into that just very quickly. Handmaiden's getting 360 noble cost increase, not for the chariot, but for the Great Eagle. Oh man. And replace martial prowess with martial mastery. I was kind of surprised that Tyrion didn't have that. I'll be honest, I thought he already did. So, increase HP per entity and melee defense for White Lines of Trace. This is literally what all my High Elf main friends have been asking for quite some time. Like all of my Ninja Penguin, Consul of Rome, all those guys. White Lions of Trace is a little bit more melee defense. The main reason for that being is because once they lose their martial prowess, their melee defense gets so low, they just die. Essentially, the reason why White Lions of Trace are just not good is because the second they lose that martial prowess, they might as well be one of the worst units for their cost in the game. It's just too low melee defense. So 4 is quite a lot, and 2 HP per entity. It's like a 90 model entity, so could be very, very decent indeed. Decreased charge bonus, though, is like, it's, oh well. We have the Wah, right? So you get, what's it called? You get the Emmerich with his new dragon horn and just Wah him up with the Pure Main Company and the White Lions. And all of a sudden, you've essentially got budget Black Orcs. All right, so Illyrian Reaver Archers. Really? Decrease costs? I feel like they're very cost effective already. We can go, it's whatever. Melee defense for the Illyrian Reavers with bows. Heralds of the Wind, decrease costs. Man, I really just don't think it's necessary, decrease costs. I see them in a lot of matchups, and overall, yeah. So I did say I would go back to talk about Teclis and his new mount on the Arcane Fix and how powerful. They did change something about Teclis in that he's essentially one of the highest winds of magic casters in the game. So be very, very careful about him. He has so much winds of magic that I think it's even possible to bring Teclis and another caster. Like you bring Metal along with Teclis with his nets. You get Plague of Rust only maybe. And then Teclis has his Bound Fiery Convocation. He's got Earth Bloods. He's kind of insane. Teclis is good. So we're done with the high elves here. Ripperdactyl, Riders of Lizardmen. I'm sure Rubber Duck of War will love these, and unfortunately none of them were changes for the Salamander hunting packs or like the Razordons. I think they're in good places. Lizardmen are in a great place. Increasing Ripperdactyl Riders are probably so squishy. They're one of the squishiest units in the game. They're squishier than Vargeists. Vargeists are squishy, right? So increased melee defense and for the Regiment Renown and normal Ripperdactyl Riders. It's nice, but it's not going to make too much of a difference. Now Norska's interesting because they're buffing the Frostworm, which is nice. Frostworm, the reason why I like this unit is not really because of the unit in combat. It's not great. It's because of the breath attacks. Because breath attacks are one of the most powerful tools in the game. Skinwolf, where can cost decrease. This was a little bit overpriced, but a 50 cost because you only bring one of these. Remember, the more unit you take, the more value you get from when you don't bring a unit. And a nice 100 cost for War Mammoths. As I got a drink of water. And War Mammoth War Shrine. But here's the thing about War Mammoths. You generally bring Wolfric, and they don't say there's a cost decrease for Wolfric on a War Mammoth, which means I don't believe it gets a cost reduction. So it's going to be a War Mammoth. You're fine. War Mammoth with War Shrine. That's cool. That's 200 is actually kind of a big difference, but same price as a normal War Mammoth. Wow. And that's something. But you generally bring Wolfric, and once you bring Wolfric, it's a little overkill to bring more than one. Or if you do bring one that's not Wolfric, you bring the Regiment Renowned, the Soul Crusher, right? So they're nice. It's not going to affect the metagame or the value as much as I think. Remember, these are my impressions, so anything's different. So I'm just looking at numbers here, remember. Now, as I said earlier, 1 increases to everything. That's nice. 2 increase for the Storm Vermin. Sword and Shield Storm Vermin I think are fine. I think the terrible unit is Storm Vermin with Halberds, and 1 increase are not going to really change that much. So, max number of enemies lowered from 32 to 28. Poison Wind Mortars. Accuracy slightly increased, though. Poison Wind Mortars are really insane right now, mainly because they deal so much damage with their poison contact effect. We're going to have to look into this later. 32 to 28 is a pretty large gap difference in numbers. So how much DPS are they going to be losing with their poison effect? Now, Tomb Kings, that's cool. Necro Sphinx leadership increased 45 to 50. That's really nice so they don't start crumbling a little bit less. But Tomb Kings are considered a really top tier faction, so buffing them is... No one's like, oh, you buffed the Tomb Kings. That's cool. And you can't go without a patch without buffing the Necropolis Knights. Increased base damage, AP, melee defense. That's a lot of decreased cost too. So what this essentially says is we are buffing. So if you guys don't know, there's a player called King of the Dead who mains Tomb Kings and Vampire Coast. And this entire section of the patch notes equals we are buffing King of the Dead. And really nobody else. Maybe Flying Taco. Yeah. Well, Flying Taco is more well known for his boxes, isn't he? So we're buffing King of the Dead. We're going to make it so that King of the Dead is even better now because he is probably the best user of Necropolis Knights and things like that. So King of the Dead, here you go. Congratulations. Your unit is very good now. Now, Vampire Coast. Rotting Prometheans cross. You don't really bring Rotting Prometheans. I'll be honest, you bring the gun variant or Regiment Renowned regenerating one. So you don't... This could be useful, especially in like the High Elf or maybe Empire matchup, but I wouldn't really put any money on it. Cost reduction for bombers and handguns. Now the Direct Droppers have been nerfed hundreds of times, what it feels like at least, and that's because the reason they're not good anymore is not really because of the cost, it's because of their accuracy. The reason they don't hit very hard, they're not very, well, they do hit pretty hard actually, but they don't hit very often anymore. So the fact that they're here, cost reduction, they're really, really good against the Chaos matchup. The Chaos, it's such a terrible time with these deckhand. You need to like bring Manticores, but they never catch up. But Bombers are, I've never thought of them as being good. But you need a lot of bombers. You need a dodge. It's a lot of it's kind of a micro trap, in my opinion. Dodging arrows with these units and still getting the value out of their bombs is quite tough for me, as like I think it'll be tough on any player, to be honest. While many players do think they are good, and I think on paper they're good, it's just too much micro to deal with them and the Salt Lord Scuttlers. Oh, I have armor sundering on that unit. That's cool. Onwards to the vampire counts. Now, if you guys don't know, I am a vampire count main. I'll say it now, and I'll say it for quite a long time until I find a faction that suits my playstyle even better. Now, Vargheist, increased melee damage 24. We already talked about one change, won't make huge differences. Another 2 Hex Wraiths. Now, it actually makes a lot more difference on the Hex Wraiths because they're ethereal, and the less times they get hit, it's actually quite a bit more effective with Hex Wraiths and Chillgeist. But I think the biggest change here is the Terrorgeist, what I want to talk about here. Increased melee attack from 26 to 38. Reduced anti-large from 35 to 25. Increased cost by 50. Now this is really interesting. This is what I like to consider a side grade. It's where you upgrade while still, like, you're lowering one aspect of something while upgrading the other, and in turn they do actually increase the cost by 50 because they think it's a net positive for Terrorgeist. Now, what does this translated buff actually mean? So increasing melee attack from 26 to 36 and reducing bonus versus large. What that really means is that they'll be mainly the same amount of effectiveness against large units. So that doesn't change too much. They lose a little bit of armor piercing, I believe, and charge bonus versus large units. That's okay. But the increased base melee attack means they can hit anything more often. Now, here's the thing about Terrorgeist, and that since I'll say this, I'm pretty confident with like vampire counts and how they play, and I must say Terrorgeists are really not good at dealing with infantry, and being increased melee attack for dealing with infantry is not really great. It doesn't affect the Terrorgeist that much. The main reason is their splash attacks are not great. You generally, when the Terrorgeist gets into infantry, I'm banking on not dealing damage to the infantry, but a terror rout caused by the Terrorgeist. So it's not really there. What I am looking for, this is a buff for the Terrorgeist in one specific matchup, and that is the Vampire Counts versus Dark Elf matchup. The reason I say this is this means the Terrorgeist will have a much easier time. Plus 10 melee attack is quite a difference with hitting Morathi and her blob. This is a very targeted buff for Terrorgeist versus single entity heroes or lords. Not infantry, because it doesn't do that much very well in the first place, and they don't have very great splash attacks, but against single entity heroes. Very specific buff here, and increasing cost by 50 is quite a change from, but in the end it's probably just going to subtract one zombie from most builds or something like that. But I want to say this buff is actually a net, or this side grade is a net nerf for the Terrorgeist, because the increased cost for 50 is really not, it's actually hurts because I have to change, it hurts me because I have to change all my pre-built builds and all that things. It's kind of annoying, but it's the increased melee attack. It's like, yeah, you'll hit Morathi and her assassin and her death hag or the master, and I cannot think of another matchup where a footlord is, where you one, bring a Terrorgeist, and two, footlords are very prominent in the matchup. Maybe Count Noctilus on foot, but he's anti-large and he has charge defense against large. I would say less so. So that's the matchup. I can only say this because I play a lot of vampire accounts. Like, trust me when I say this. Like, I play them a lot. I proudly am a main for them. This really just makes it so that the Dark Elves matchup is a little bit harder, and really nothing else. Now, same thing for the Strigoi Vampire Lord, Strigoi Ghoulkling. The only times I bring this is in the Norska matchup, because you don't need breath attacks as nearly as powerful in that matchup, and Vampire Lord, Strigoi Vampire Lord is actually really powerful. It's just the only you're losing out breath attacks, and that's a huge loss. Now, on to Warriors of Chaos. I believe Warriors of Chaos is my second most played faction in this game by far. Like, Greenskins is probably my third, but Warriors of Chaos is my second. And I used to main them. I used to consider myself a Warrior of Chaos main, and then I just fell in love with vampire counts after lore and all that stuff. Now, cost decrease for armored trolls. I've been using a lot of trolls lately for the Chaos roster, and armored trolls are really nice. I remember that one replay send where it was against Empire, where I brought them, and they were okay against them. And this is nice. Now, the reason why you don't bring Chaos Trolls armored, it's because Chaos Spawn are a thing, and Chaos Spawn are just better. Now, the biggest thing that I'm excited for is the Hell Cannon, increased piece HP to 1,701, 1950. That's just insane! That means you might be able to... Here's the difference. The reason why the Hell Cannon is not good is not because you can't defend it from projectiles. You can move up forward, that's okay. It's because breath attacks from Malekith, dragons, zombie dragons, anything like that. Or you don't bring in the Vampire Cut matchup anyway, but just Malekith, Star Dragon, any breath attack or sniping from Wood Elves and all this stuff is just so devastating against the Hell Cannon. So if this makes it they can survive a point-blank breath attack, Hell Cannons are insane now, because wasting 2 breath attacks on this thing is much more effective than 1, and increase accuracy slightly. Here's a little note. Hell Cannons are not anti-infantry. They're anti-large cavalry or cavalry-sized units. They miss infantry way too often to be useful. Unless it's very high-costing infantry like Blackguard, you don't use them. You use them against like cavalry such as Cold One Knights, Knights of the Ebon Claw, Slaanesh Harvesters, Dragon Princes. That's how you use Hell Cannons. That's, in my opinion, that is. Forsaken, slight changes. Only to the Regiment Renown, so that's cool. Minus melee damage and interval, and increased armor piercing. That's cool. Wood Elves, increased melee defense, just 1 number changes. There's nothing really to be there. And I think that's really about to be all. Just over 40 minutes, and we're going to do just slight look at these spells and abilities. They're making it so that the abilities are more consistent at short range, so they can now actually friendly fire, but they won't be like invisible in the first few seconds. Just as I say this, there was one replay where one of our friends in the Warhammer community and Papa Palpatine played as Chaos versus Vampire Counts, and he missed a point-blank fireball against the Vampire Count Dragon while his Warriors of Chaos Dragon was fighting, and missing a point-blank fireball is that's not good. But overall, that's a really cool change. And summoning changed so that if you have the 20 unit cap, you can still summon is very nice for Vampire Counts, Skaven, and Beastmen. And you'll see, but maybe not as well for Beastmen. Some nice spell rebalances here, but overall, I've read over these, and they're really not too cool. It's like, okay, that's nice. But it's the transformation of Kadan and the Savage Dominion, increasing Winds of Magic 15 to 18 and 13 to 14 is really actually big. The reason why is because the Beastmen are known, their best build in the game is the summon spam, where they get Chaos Spawn, they get Manticores, they get Cygors, and unfortunately, this is going to make it so that it just comes and might still be able to happen, because Jagged Dagger is a very powerful item. But Winds of Magic, it's essentially going to be changed down to we're going to have to stagger the summons more often, and Jagged Dagger will have to be used more often before you get all your summon value. So if you want to get into this website, I'll leave a link to the patch notes. But overall, looking over the abilities and how we've already seen the Spinning Loons, we've seen that from other channels, the Sword of Teclis, and Winds of Magic Reserves and Sword of Teclis is so great. And yeah, I hope you guys liked the video. Leave a like if you did, and subscribe if you want more. Hopefully you didn't fall asleep this time, James, and I'll catch you guys later.